the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, CERN scientists who make boson discovery that causes statues to come to life and sing Cockney tunes jailed under the Frankenstein laws. Adrift in space waiting for the solar winds to kick in. Plus, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of David Weber's Uncompromising Honor. All right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen Senior Editor Tony Daniel. This time we have a roundtable discussion on the weird Western anthology, Straight Outta Dodge City. Our own redoubtable consulting editor, David Afsharirad, conducts the talk, which includes Straight Outta Dodge City editor, David Boop, plus contributing writers, and hey, it's a superstar lineup for this one, Mercedes Lackey, Joe R. Lansdale, and Jonathan Maberry. So that is coming up. Plus, we continue the complete audiobook serialization of David Weber's Honor Harrington series masterpiece, Uncompromising Honor. Now here's the news. We have new fiction and non-fiction at the Baen.com front page right now. We usually put up a story or a piece to give you a taste of the world of an upcoming book, or generally just to provide interesting and cool reading. And both, of course. Now up at Baen.com is Adrift by Frank Chadwick. This is a story set in the world of Frank's upcoming science fiction novel, Ship of Destiny. Alien Intrigue. Marissa Marfoglia was the only human and only female governor of Simkitrak Transstellar, the largest manufacturer of interstellar jump drives in the Kodahas, which is the world that Frank writes in, a position she held only because she was fiscal guardian of a Varoki minor. Those are one of the alien races of the Kodahas. The rest of the Board of Governors, of course, wants her gone. The slightest misstep, and she could put the well-being of her family in grave danger. So when her sister Aurora shows up with another dangerous scheme, Mar is ready to dismiss her yet again, but something about the way Aurora is acting makes Mar think maybe there's something to her sister's plan this time. Anyway, it won't hurt to listen and find out, or will it? Also up now at the Baen.com website is a great nonfiction piece by Les Johnson that is called Beamed Energy for Space Exploration, Giant Leap or Incremental Steps, Sailing Through on a Beam of Light. Space exploration is all about giant leaps, and with more and more private sector money being poured into spaceflight, it may be that the 21st century will propel humankind ever closer to the science-fictional dreams of spreading out among the stars. One such endeavor is Starshot, an initiative of Breakthrough Initiatives. It aims to propel a spacecraft farther and faster than ever before through the use of beamed energy and reflective sails. In this month's nonfiction essay, space scientist Les Johnson explores the possibilities of this cutting-edge technology. Beamed Energy for Space Exploration, Giant Leap or Incremental Steps by Les Johnson, and Adrift by Frank Chadwick are now available for your reading pleasure, all for free at Baen.com. And after March 15th, they will be included in two great free ebook anthologies that you can download at Baen.com forever, perpetually, in all our many formats as well. These anthologies are called Free Stories 2020 and Free Nonfiction 2020. So get to the website or get the anthology ebooks, and happy reading.
Hey everybody, or perhaps I should say howdy partners, David Afsharirad here. I'm happy to be back on the Baen Free Radio Hour, where this week we are talking about weird westerns, things that go bump at high noon. First there was Straight Outta Tombstone, then Straight Outta Deadwood, and now the weird and wild, wild west rides again with Straight Outta Dodge City, an all-new anthology of weird western stories available now in trade paperback and all ebook formats. Joining me today to talk about the book is Mercedes Lackey. She has over 135 titles in print, with 4 being published last year alone. And some of her foreign language editions can be found in Russian, German, Czech, Polish, French, Italian, Turkish, and Japanese. She has written and published books in many, many series, some of which I'm sure Baen readers will be familiar with, if not all of them, including The Secret World Chronicles, Hunter, Valdemar, Elemental Masters, Serrated Edge, Elven Baen, and Obsidian Mountain. Misty Lackey, thank you so much for coming on the Baen Free Radio Hour.
Ye, as they say, ha.
Also joining us is Joe R. Lansdale. He is the author of over 40 novels and 400 shorter works. His work has been made into films Bubba Hotep and Cold in July, as well as the acclaimed Sundance TV show Hap and Leonard. He's received numerous recognitions for his work, among them the Edgar, the Spur, as well as 10 Bram Stokers. He's also received the Grand Master Award and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Horror Writers Association. He's been inducted into the Texas Literary Hall of Fame and is writer-in-residence at Stephen F. Austin State University. Joe Lansdale, thanks for coming on.
Thank you. And it's actually 50 novels, but who's counting, right?
I was gonna make a joke that you'd probably written more since I looked up that bio, and I guess I should have. That was the case.
Yeah, well, I got a film coming out. They're starting to film my movie, The Thicket, next month with Peter Dinklage.
Oh, I think I saw you post about that on Facebook. Yeah, that's a Western, right? Maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
That's why I mentioned it.
You guys are also prolific. I imagine you're probably still writing novels while we're doing this podcast.
Well, also maybe writing a novel while we talk is Jonathan Maberry. He's a New York Times best-selling author, 5-time Bram Stoker Award winner, and a comic book writer. His vampire apocalypse book series V-Wars is in production as a Netflix original series. His works include the Joe Ledger thrillers, the Rot and Ruin series, and the Dead of Night series. He's editor of many high-profile anthologies as well. He is a board member of the Horror Writers Association and the president of the International Association of Media Tie-In Writers. Jonathan Maberry, thank you and welcome to the Baen Podcast.
Thanks for having me here. And like Joe, I have an update on my bio. The V-War show actually was released in December. And we're now keeping our fingers crossed for that second season pickup.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, congratulations on that. Yeah, I've got 2 little kids at home, so I know all about DuckTales, but not so much the other stuff that's on Netflix.
Yeah. V-Wars is not kid friendly. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to watch it when they're in bed or something. All right, and finally, the sheriff round these parts, the man who wrestled up the posse, Mr. David Boop, the editor of Straight Outta Dodge City, as well as the other anthologies in the series. Mentioned those. Those are Straight Outta Tombstone and Straight Out of Deadwood. He's a Denver-based speculative fiction author and editor. His debut novel, the sci-fi noir She Murdered Me with Science, returned to print in 2017 from Wordfire Press. His second novel, The Soul Changers, is a serialized Victorian horror novel set in Pinnacle Entertainment's World of Rippers Resurrected. It's almost a tongue twister. He is a prolific short story writer and game designer as well. David Boop, welcome back to the podcast. It's good to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure. And I have an update. That Rippers Resurrected novel, which was available only online, should be available in print hopefully by the end of this year. So I'm very excited to have my second novel in print, as well as being my first full media tie-in novel. So it's great.
All right. Excellent. Well, congratulations on that. Like I mentioned, we are here to talk about weird westerns, specifically Straight Outta Dodge City, which is out now from Baen Books in trade paper and ebook format. But I want to talk about, I know as writers and even as editors and people in publishing, sometimes we bristle against too fine a genre definitions, and when you start sounding like those guys talking about post-punk, hardcore, metal, these little tiny micro genres of music. But I did want to talk for people who maybe haven't heard about weird westerns or say, what in the world is that? Just maybe going around, and David Boop, let's end with you since you are the man at the stick on this. But what does weird western mean to you all when you hear that term, and how would you describe it to readers?
Dude, the original Wild Wild West TV show.
Yes.
That's it, right there. Covers it all.
Well, you know, there's the dime novels though too that were done back at the late in the 1800s, early 1900s. They had Jesse James and the steam-powered horses, and I found some of those things actually in library books that had been bound and put together. So those were like from way back. And then Robert E. Howard was writing weird westerns, and of course that primed me for the Wild Wild West. That did it, and so I think there's been so much of that, but it's always been scattered. And when I wrote a novel called Dead in the West, and I actually wrote it in 1980. It was published, serialized in 1985, and put into a novel form in 1986. It was optioned numerous times and sold, and was never made into a film. But when I did that, that was a genre that it just wasn't out there. And not that there hadn't been a few here and there, and of course stuff in the past. But I've been really excited to see it really catch on in more recent times. It's certainly not as big a market as some people would like to think it is, but it's certainly a far bigger market than it once was.
Yeah, and Weird West, I mean, it isn't just gunslinger fiction. It's stuff set in that era, the less industrialized version of America. I mean, you have stuff like Circus of Dr. Lau by Charles Finney that set the Old West, technically a Weird West,
yes.
Very Weird West. And that was in the 30s, 34 or 5, I think. And, there were stories by, Robert E. Howard, you mentioned, in a bunch of books. And you have, just about everyone's taken a swing at it at one time or another. All the, from back then all the way to Stephen King's The Dark Tower series is a Weird West, structure.
Yeah.
Even William Burroughs did.
And I'm sure Mark Twain must have messed with that.
Yeah.
Or Ambrose Bierce.
Yeah, and Louis L'Amour with the Haunted Mesa, had some theory elements.
That's right.
It doesn't actually have to be science fiction or horror. It just has to be weird, and weird's a pretty nice broad umbrella for stories to be under.
Well, you remember all of the weird westerns in the late 50s, early 60s, something like Jesse James' Daughter meets Frankenstein or something like that. Billy the Kid meets Dracula. Yeah. And my favorite, Curse of the Undead.
Yeah, Valley of the Guanji with cowboys and dinosaurs. You've got Billy the Kid versus versus Dracula, and then Jesse James versus Dracula's daughter.
And then we go into TV series. I remember there's an episode of Bonanza where Haas is imagining leprechauns. That had to be in the early 60s. There's a ton of stuff. The Tremor series, is Weird West.
The Hanged Man didn't last long. They made a movie called I'm sorry, my bad. No, I said they made a movie called The Hanged Man with Stephen Forrest that was on TV for a while. It's a guy that hung, comes back to life, and becomes an Avenger.
That's right. God, I haven't thought about that in years. Plus, there's a good Weird West comic.
High Plains Drifter certainly qualifies.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm thinking too. There were a lot of Twilight Zone episodes that took place in the Old West. There's the one with Martin Landau, and he's they're gunslingers. There's that George Clayton Johnson, The Execution, where Albert Salmi is being hung, and as he's hanging there, Russell Johnson, the guy who played the professor, I think was the actor, brought someone randomly back forward in time to the current era at that time, 1960. Mm-hmm. So they did it a lot as well. Now that
Yeah. Well, they had that one with Lee Marvin. It was good.
Yeah. There's a great anthology series out of Canada. There's a great anthology series out of Canada called Dead Man's Son.
Briscoe County Jr.
Yeah.
Yes, and Briscoe County
We
Jr.
could literally go on and on because there's such a rich legacy of Weird West stories. I mean, I came into Weird West from comic books, from some weird stories in Phantom Rider and Rawhide Kid and Jonah Hex. It's an area that just lends itself to any kind of bizarre storytelling and filmmaking.
Right. Well, I wrote Jonah Hex comics, and as well as I wrote a Jonah Hex story for Batman the Animated Series, and I wrote a short Jonah Hex piece for them. So I've always been attracted to Jonah Hex as well as, just weird westerns in general.
David Boop, since you are the editor of this, I know Tony Weiskopf knows what weird westerns are, but when you pitched this to her, or when you were coming up with this idea and you were approaching authors, kind of what guidelines did you give them within this really, really broad Weird West, or did you not? Did you say, hey, you define it the way you want to define it and write me a story?
So the one guideline, the one caveat that had to be in every single story was at least part of the story had to take place in the Old West. It didn't matter whether it was in the future or contemporary or whatever. Through the majority of the story, there had to be at least a flashback, a connection to the Old West at some point. That was the only caveat that I had. After that, it was pretty much up to whatever they could imagine. So as far as that goes, I wanted to see a variety of interpretations of what the Old West was. I didn't want cliches. If you're going to play with a trope, then give me a twist on that trope and so forth. And everybody did an amazing job. I mean, they run the gambit of stories with, heroes victorious, heroes losing. You have fantasy, horror, science fiction, mystery. There's a little bit of everything within the free anthology. And the great thing is this last one, Straight Outta Dodge City, really kind of the caveat from it. It's with Jonathan's story at the end, it's like it puts a point that this is the Weird West as finance enjoys. And it was so much fun to do. As far as approaching the authors, everybody I approached in a different way. For example, Butcher for Tombstone, I got him when I asked him if any of his Dresden characters had been around in the Old West, and he said, yeah. And I said, about an origin story. And he said, I hadn't thought about it, but yeah, I'd love to do that. And as far as Joe goes, well, I guilted into it for a period of, about 3-4 years now, Joe, I've been on you?
Yeah.
We did a panel, World Famous in San Antonio on Weird Westerns. And afterwards I said, I'm putting together an anthology. And he said, oh. And I said, you are like, one of the premier Weird Western, if not one of the kings of the field. Can I get a story for you? And he said, sure. And then a couple of years later, when I actually reached out to him, he's like, we're filming Hap and Leonard right now. Catch me on the next one. Which I did, and then hound him mercilessly, guilted him until he gave me a story. So, every approach was different.
We kind of talked about this a little bit just when we were talking about defining the genre. But I remember we did a podcast, David Boop and I and some of the other contributors for the first book in this series. And I should have done my research and gone back and listened to it to tell you the exact author. But we were talking about how does it differ writing a weird Western or just a straight Western and something else. And he was saying, in many ways, the Old West is a fantasy setting. In a lot of ways, that didn't exist the way we think it did. And anymore, especially, people don't have a connection. You have to, in a way, do a bit of world building the way you do with any sort of science fiction or fantasy. And I just wonder what it is about this period and the fantasy of this period, the idea of this period. Why do you all think you are drawn to it, continue to be drawn to it, and readers, like Joe was saying, maybe not even are still drawn to it, and the fact of weird Westerns are kind of even being more and more drawn to it than they have been in the past. And I just wonder if you all could talk a little bit about the appeal of it, what you think the appeal is.
Well, I think part of the appeal is the fact that literally anything can happen. There was so much poorly documented about the Old West. I think Joe started to mention that our version of the Old West that we see on TVs and movies doesn't really resemble the way the West was. So it's become a fantasy setting. It is no longer actually an historical setting, and that allows us so much creative room to tell any kind of story, and for readers to expect things out of the ordinary, beyond their experience, and so on.
Yeah, what I always think in most of the ones I've done is I really want it to be like what history we have of the Old West and what we know about it. And then I want to interject the outlandish or the weird aspects. But I try to avoid, at least purposely, making it anachronistic. I try to put things in context. And part of that is that I've been a fan of Westerns for a long, long time. I read Western history long before I became interested in Western novels, and I watched Western films growing up, so it's always been there. And I think probably the truth is I don't really have a favorite genre, but the Westerns come close. I've written maybe two straight Western novels, The Magic Wagon and the Dead in the West, and bunches of short stories. And every time I do, I feel like I'm tapping into something that's very natural to me because of when I grew up, because in the 50s, Westerns were really, really big. And 60s, early 60s, middle 60s, every channel had Westerns. You could turn it on to be two or three of them right behind each other. And I think that lately, although they burned everybody out for a while, I think that people are starting to look at them fresh. And I think they're also starting to look at the Western genre in a fresher, more unique manner.
Yeah.
Misty Lackey, do you have any thoughts on that? What the enduring appeal of the Western and how it is in a way a fantasy setting, or no?
Oh, it absolutely is a fantasy setting, and that's largely because when movie making moved out to California, they were trying to churn stuff out as cheap as they could, and they essentially invented the Wild West as we know it, because it was cheap to put together. They had the set right out their backyard. All they had to do was grab some hats and guns and put them on people, and boom, the Westerns craze was invented, more or less.
Yeah,
they could grab plots from the old dime novels that they wouldn't have to pay writers for. So it was basically already fantasy.
Yeah, and something else though that's weird about that was always fantasy, but when they were making that, when they first started making the Westerns, people like Wyatt Earp were still alive, and Bat Masterson and Annie Oakley and Buffalo Bill died just before that. He died in 1917. But I mean, these things were either close within time, or they were the people that were part of the Western legends were still alive, and so they were borrowing a lot of things from a reality and then mixing it with this sometimes absurd fantasy. But the weird thing is I'd watch the Roy Rogers television shows, and you would have them going out to riding horses, and then somebody would show up in a Jeep or a plane. They would stop at a bank robbery and make a phone call. But, a lot of that really wasn't inaccurate altogether, because the Old West didn't just die in 1900. Like, my father was born in 1909, and when he was a boy, they still rode horses. He told me the first time he ever saw a plane, and cars, of course, were coming in, and that got to be the thing. But they still rode horses when he was a boy, and still used wagons and things like that. And when I was a kid living in East Texas, you'd have many people who still have mule-drawn or horse-drawn wagons because that's how they work their fields with their plow. They take them out there, they hook the mules up and plow. And even I used to plow with a mule. So what's really weird about this is to realize that it's not that far away. And when I was growing up, it was even closer. And when my father was growing up, he only missed the closing of the West by 9 years until Mark Twain was alive.
Yeah, and a lot. One of my favorite. I just want to throw something in on that real quick. One of my favorite lines that kind of defines that whole era is the line from Liberty Valance. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
Yep.
And sometimes the mundane details of life in the Old West aren't as interesting as the stories that we want to tell. So even the people like Doc Holliday and I'm sorry, like Bat Masterton and the Earps, they contributed to their own the fiction of their own careers, because it made them more interesting, and they profited from it. I imagine, and it became more fantastic, more fun.
Well, yeah, it's like Wild Bill Hickok had a shootout at the station early on where he probably hid behind a curtain and dropped this guy, and then by the time it was in, his supposedly the biography of his life, it was him killing all these people in hand-to-hand combat and all of that. But that's part of what I grew up with as a child was in East Texas. You could tell, you told the truth, but you also could tell stories. And when you told stories, people sort of knew that you were embellishing them. That was just part of the tradition. So if it was, something that you were describing, you would use hyperbole, or you would use these outstanding similes or some sort of metaphorical approach to telling the story to make it seem more hot and alive. And you might even been telling, for the most part, the truth, but the truth had a lot of dressing on it,
Yeah.
It's not that far of a stretch to go from, you encounter a bear in the woods to I encountered a dragon in the woods in the Old West. It's real easy to embellish that because everybody's heard bear stories, and but you start adding a level to it each time. You're leveling up the story each time you tell it, and that's where the magic comes in. All of these stories that are in these palaces, especially Straight Outta Dodge City, you see a real story behind the fantasy story. There could have been logical explanations for a lot of these stories, but the great thing about it is that the authors take us someplace where we, as fantasy horror readers, science fiction readers, want to go. You want to believe that there were dragons in the Old West. We want to believe that voodoo trains show up and werewolves were around and all of that. So we want to believe that, and it's not that hard to go from what really happened to the amazing.
What, are you trying to say that werewolves aren't real? Crush me here, man.
They're not on the podcast, man. We're not outing them yet.
One thing I wanted to talk about, I think, Jonathan, you said, re-examining some of this stuff and looking at it from a way that maybe we haven't seen. And I think starting even back with the spaghetti westerns, you started to see this, it's not dismantling, not deconstruction, but sort of looking at the myth of the West in a different way. And I think, when we were talking about the Hollywood Cowboys, I thought of that, if you've seen it, I know Joe has because we've talked about it, but Ballad of Buster Scruggs, the first segment of that is sort of dealing with the reality of the Old West versus the 1930s singing cowboy kind of version of it. But one thing, too, that stood out to me when I was reading the stories, especially, you three's stories in here, is that these stories all involve non-white characters to some degree, and whether Native Americans or African Americans. And we talked a little bit about this with Straight Outta Tombstone, and I've talked with David Boop just offhand at Dragon Con and things about this, and this sort of including of the wider swath of the population that lived in this country and continue to, but lived during this period. Besides, sort of like the white lawman or the white outlaw. Not that there aren't plenty of stories of those two types to tell, but I wonder, when you all were writing your stories, was that something you were consciously trying to do, or did include these other perspectives, or did that was the story that grabbed you at the time? And Dave, maybe talk about wanting to include these stories.
Right. I've always been interested in the black experience in the West. And in fact, I wrote a book called Paradise Sky that I'd researched and tried to write for 30 years. And when I first tried to write it, they said, well, black people don't read and white people don't want to read about black people. And I thought, well, I'm not buying that. And so then I tried it again in the 1990s, and they were a little bit more politically correct. They said, we don't know who our audience is. And then in recent years, my publisher now, Mulholland Little Brown, they liked it, and I wrote it, and got, it's one of I think it's my best book. Everybody has their own difference. It's kind of a historical, it's kind of a Western, but it's also humorous, and it takes all of these different black characters that I had read about, and I put their experience into it. And when I was growing up, I lived in the South during Jim Crow. And so I saw a lot of that going on a daily basis. And so those characters for me were the characters I saw, many of them that I knew, and they just became part of my storytelling process, because some of the stories that I got as a kid were told to me by the old black men sitting around at the feed store when I would go up there, and they'd get used to me coming there, and I would sit down on the stoops and listen to them talk. And after they got used to me, they began to be more free about telling their story. And my dad and all of my people, they had all those old Western tales too. So the idea of including people that were before sort of like ignored, it's not a matter of just saying I'm going to put black people in the West. Black people were in the West, and they influenced it, from the Buffalo Soldiers to the Marshals that Hanging Judge Parker had. People like Bass Reeves, who may have been the influence for the Lone Ranger. I think that may be stretching it a bit, but I like that idea. He certainly could have been. And all of those characters have fascinated me all of my life. And Jim Crow was one of those things that was just like a scar on our country, And so that impacted me to where I've written straight novels about black characters and different kinds of characters, and white characters, of course, as well, because these are the people that I grew up around. And, I'm sure they can tell their own stories better than I can tell them. But in some ways, their stories are part of me, too. And my perspective on that is maybe my perspective, but it's what I've got. So it's always been fascinating to me to look at it from the standpoint of other people, and how their experiences were different from mine and how we influenced each other.
Yeah, I have a real weird path into this. I grew up in an extremely racist household, extremely racist neighborhood. My father ran the local chapter of the Klan. So, it was a pretty rough environment to grow up into. And I went up, once I started breaking away from that, skewed mindset, I started reading about, history of, America as it really was. And, I found, I was reading about, Bass Reeves and other folks in the Old West. There was a huge population of blacks, of Hispanics in the cowboy era. Half the country was owned by Spain. Of course, there are people of color all over the goddamn country, and that brings in a rich cultural diversity that was literally whitewashed by Hollywood. And that's what I like.
Yeah, every third or fourth cowboy was black or brown.
Yeah, exactly. And to not address that, and also there were a lot of Native Americans and mixed breeds of various types back then that were part. Some were mixed and living among Native Americans. Some were mixed and living among essentially the white population. So when I picked my character, I picked a character of mixed race, and that was not. It's not stunt casting. That's the Old West. The Old West was probably one of the most significant melting pots in all of America.
Yeah, and sort of ironic then that we don't in the past we haven't thought of it that way. Misty Lackey, you live in Oklahoma, which my perspective in Texas, has always been, sometimes other people feel nice. I always liked Oklahoma every time I've been there, but don't tell anyone in Texas I said that.
Hey, I'm from Texas. I heard it. I heard you say it.
Oh no, Lansdale's gonna rat me out. Anyways, but
yeah, Oklahoma is just northern Texas.
But there's a different relationship to Native American with the history up there of the reservations and whatnot. And your story is about the land rush essentially, and I just wondered if you had some thoughts on this and maybe where you live, giving you a point of view that maybe I don't know. There's my question, I guess, kind of muddled.
Well, when I moved here, Oklahoma was one of the last places in this swath of the country that was essentially stolen twice from the natives. The First Nations people, a lot of them ended up getting dumped here, especially the Cherokee, because no white person wanted the land, and then all of a sudden the white people wanted the land, and here comes the land rush. Land rushes, there were actually several of them. And I was kind of fascinated by that when I moved here. And I've been privileged to know quite a few of the Osage elders out here. And the Osage actually are one of the few First Nations people that lived in the part of Oklahoma where I live. And I did a lot of research on them when I was doing a book called Sacred Ground. And I thought it would be kind of fascinating if I just sort of combined the Osage in religion in with my own elemental masters stuff and designated them as a kind of elemental master. So that's what I did with it, and I used one of their main deities, Grandmother Spider, as you probably noticed, because spiders for most people are inherently creepy.
Yep. And David Boop, I was wondering if you had any thoughts in putting this together about that, including different points of view, because you did it whether you meant to or not. I was just wondering about that.
So, my thought has always been, sell them on the reality before you sell them on the fantasy. Sort of like what Joe was saying earlier. And for me, doing research on the Old West, you find that until the end of the Civil War, you have more women, blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans than you do like Anglo-Saxon white males in the West. And a lot of, let's say, freed slaves or escaped slaves came west. There was whole towns founded by Mexicans coming up over the border. Women ran towns. Usually, if you were a brothel owner, whether you were officially running the town or not, you were really running the town. And so look at the Old West, what we did in film and television for so long with the whitewashing and so forth. I said, we can't tell that Old West. We need to tell the real Old West. So I kept it very open. I did not go down a list and pick certain stories to make sure that I had an Asian, a Native American, and stuff like that. What I did was I wanted to make sure that I explored many points of view, and luckily, I've gotten such amazing authors, many who have been previously published doing weird westerns, but like semi-pro, and a lot of them aren't known in the pro market, but I gave them an opportunity to explore their characters. So in that regard, I wanted to make sure that the whole West was explored. And it's difficult because, a lot of steampunk and weird Western is what they call revisionist past or retrofuturism or things like that, where we have everybody's enlightened and every encounter with a Native American or other is a enlightened experience. Like the heroes were always the one person who knew that everything that was going on was wrong, right? And it's not always the case. And what I like about what everybody did is there are no easy, comfortable answers to anything. Nothing is glossed over. Things are very real. They're very brutal at times. And I love that. I love looking at the uncomfortableness of that time period, but also I love the chance for people to evolve and grow and to be better. And everybody just gave me such amazing stories, regardless of point of view. All the characters are true to themselves, and I love that.
Yeah. You also have a kind of an interesting story in here. It's an interesting story, and it's an interesting story because we see your story, The Ragdoll Kid, or you can give me the full title in a second, but
The Murder of the Ragdoll Kid.
The Murder of the Ragdoll Kid, which is a revised version of basically the story that, for you, kicked this off. You didn't set out to edit 3 weird Western anthologies for Baen initially.
No, I did not.
And you might want to tell just briefly, and then unfortunately we're going to probably have to wrap this up here in a second. But I liked in your introduction you talked about how you got pulled into this sort of inadvertently, and so if you want to talk about that and just mention your story and how that plays into the story of that wound up with three weird Western anthologies from Baen that you edited.
And about 60 pieces of short fiction out there. Not all in the same world. So The Ragdoll Kid was a story I submitted to the Tony Hillerman's Mystery Western Writing Contest that he used to put on for his writers' conference. And the idea was it had to be a mystery and it had to be set in the Old West. So I wrote this story because I originally thought I was going to be a mystery writer. I did not know I was going to be a science fiction fantasy writer. I thought I was going to write mystery. And so I wrote this story where an outlaw is, long after his time, has been murdered, and his ghost has to solve his own murder. And so I set it in this fictional town called Drowned Horse, Arizona, that may resemble a little bit of the town I'm sitting in now, but that's purely coincidental. The fact that I spent 2 years in the town should not be equated to the fact that I wrote the town as a damned place. But I came up with this idea of a cursed town in the Old West, and when the story was published by David Lee Summers, who had a story in Straight Out of Tombstone, in his magazine, Tales of the Talisman, which is now defunct. But when that got published, David Riley, who does Science Fiction Trails magazine, liked the story so much he asked me to write a story for his magazine, which I did. And then next thing I know, I'm getting invites to weird Western anthologies and so forth. So over a period of time, this non-weird Western, it was a mystery, turned out to be the catalyst for me exploring deeper into the weird Western and Western genres, as it were, to tell those stories that have yet to be told. So when it came down to doing an anthology, again, quite by accident, I was on a panel with Jim Butcher, and I was trying to find something to talk about afterwards, and they just basically said, what I had said earlier, do you have a character in the Old West? And he said, yeah. I said, well, I'm doing an anthology. And next thing I know, he says, yeah, I'll give you a story. So now I have to put an anthology together. And 3 anthologies later, Tony's been very gracious with allowing me this chance to explore this genre in a way that has not really been done before. In a lot of cases, these are other people's worlds where they've written a weird Western in a book series that is not necessarily in the West. And to take some of those well-known characters and put them in the Old West has been fascinating and fun to see the possibilities. And it's just been a great experience. And working with the 3 absolutely masters that are on the phone here with me, it's been great. And it's also been easy as an editor because they're all amazing writers and I haven't had to edit them all that much. So I picked the people for the anthology very carefully because I don't like to work hard. So everybody just gave me just great stories, and it was a wonderful experience.
Well, I had some more questions, but I think we answered them all kind of in the course of asking other things and talking about other things. So I just want to close with if you guys would all you can plug your own stuff if you want, but if you want to just give the listeners besides all the Straight Outta Dodge, Straight Outta Tombstone, Straight Outta Deadwood stuff, if someone picks up this book and they think I want more of this, where would you suggest they look next? What's a favorite book or movie or television series? I know we mentioned a lot of them early on, so we may be treading over the same ground again. But
well, I'd like to plug something that's both mine and someone else's. I was asked to do a novel based on the Deadlands role-playing game, which is steampunk, alt history, supernatural western. So it's a little bit of everything. And I did a book for that series, and then Jeff Marriott did one, and Shonen McGuire did one, and their books are just absolutely fantastic. Very weird.
Yeah, in Straight Outta Deadwood, Shane Hensley wrote a Deadlands story and gave it to Shane owns Deadlands, and he gave us a story in Deadlands too. So yes, very much. If you like the story in Deadlands, John's work, definitely check out that those books, the Deadlands novels.
And Jonathan, did you say the title of it?
Yeah, mine is called Ghostwalkers. It's Ghostwalkers. Jeff Marriott's is Thunder Moon Rising, and Shonen's is Boneyard.
All right, very good. Misty Lackey, what about you? What anything you've done or others have done that you think would be a good, after the gateway drug of Straight Outta Dodge City, something to check out, some weird westerns or something similar?
Well, not necessarily weird western, but most people don't know that the great Ray Lafferty wrote a wonderful novel about First Nations people in Oklahoma here called Oklahonally. And it's available from the University of Oklahoma Press, I believe.
All right, we'll go get a copy of that.
Yeah,
so
he mostly wrote short stories. Yeah, it was unique.
Okay.
And Joe, what about you? I know we talked about you got the Thicket coming out as a movie and Paradise Sky of yours, and you've written many, many others, but anything else of yours or anyone else's?
Well, The Thicket is not necessarily a weird western, but in the book it has a dwarf, a little person that's in it, and of course Dinklage liked the book a lot, and he picked it up, and but it's not really a weird book so much as it deals with characters that aren't normally dealt with in the West, and it has a number of interesting characters that I think that are often ignored in Western fiction. But I have a book coming out called Jane Goes North, which is about a road novel between two women heading from East Texas up to Boston. And it's about how they get along or don't get along on that trip. It's a straight novel. And then I have More Better Deals coming out from Little Brown, which is a crime novel. And right now is The Sky Done Rip, which is a fantasy novel from Subterranean. Oh, and then there's a Happen Leonard collection called Michael Minestrone short stories about when they were young.
You want my recommendations too?
Yeah, oh yeah, David Boop, of course. I forgot. Yeah, not forgot you. I forgot where we were in the when we're talking on the phone. I don't have a visual. Yeah, David Boop, you give us your thoughts.
Well, conveniently enough, the story that's in Straight Outta Dodge City is in my Drowned Horse Chronicle, which is a continuing series of short stories set in this cursed town of Drowned Horse, Arizona. And recently, you, as editor, bought a Drowned Horse story for the Chronicles of David. So that just recently came out from Baen. So if you like Drowned Horse, you can find another one immediately in Chronicles of David. But these are the Chronicles. The Drowned Horse Chronicle is scattered in many anthologies and magazines over a period of about 10 years now. But I am working on the first collection, and I'm hoping to have the first collection out within a year or so. There's 3 arcs, and I'm going to do the first arc, the early years of Drowned Horse, and then go from there. So, yeah, and as far as recommendations, I gave 3 anthologies of recommendations. Every one of the authors in there have amazing novels, have amazing other short fiction. They've all earned the right to be there by years and years of just amazing story after amazing story after amazing story. And so I recommend anybody in the 3 anthologies, especially everything that my 3 colleagues here on the podcast with have written. I am honored. I truly was honored by their stories and their willingness to be in here as well as everybody else. It's humbling to work with such amazing talent, and it's helped, even me as an editor boost up my writing. And so I thank you guys all and everybody who's been in any of the anthologies.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, and we want to thank you. Yeah, and we want to thank you for being on the Baen Free Radio Hour here. It's been great talking with everybody, and we really appreciate you coming on to talk about the anthology, Straight Outta Dodge City, and your stories and all things regular West and Weird West, Old West, New West, Weird West. So once again, it's out now in trade paperback and ebook. They're the 2 previous books in the series, Straight Outta Deadwood, Straight Outta Deadwood and Straight Outta Tombstone are also out in those formats. And I know Straight Outta Tombstone is in mass market. Straight Outta Deadwood either is or will be shortly. So you can pick those up if you like what you see in them. Well, thank you so much to my guests, David Boop and Jonathan Maberry, Mercedes Lackey, and Joe Lansdale for coming on and talking to us today. Thank you all so much.
Well, thank you for having us. We enjoyed being had.
Right off into the sunset.
Exactly. Happy trails.
Here is another entry in David Weber's Honor Harrington series masterpiece, Uncompromising Honor. Honor keeps her promise. The Solarian League. For hundreds of years they have borne the banner of human civilization. But the bureaucratic mandarins who rule today's League are corrupt and looking for scapegoats. They've decided the upstart Star Kingdom of Manticore must be annihilated. Uncompromising courage. Honor Harrington has worn the Star Kingdom's uniform for half a century. Very few know war the way Honor Harrington does. So far, hers has been a voice of caution. But now the Mandarins have committed atrocities such as the galaxy has not known in 1,000 years. They have finally killed too many of the people Honor Harrington loves. Uncompromising vengeance. Now Honor Harrington is coming for the Solarian League. and hell is riding in her wake. And now, David Weber's Uncompromising Honor.
SLNS Quebec, Zung System, Solarian League. Well, sir, all I can say is that it's about friggin' time, Captain Gabriella Timberlake growled, standing at Admiral Vincent Capriotti's shoulder as they gazed at the latest dispatch on Capriotti's display. The fact that the Zung system was just under 70 light years from Sol meant Task Force 783 had gotten the new general order sooner than most of the rest of the Solarian League Navy, and Capriotti wondered how the Navy's other flag officers were going to react to them. For that matter, he wasn't entirely certain how he felt about them. "I can't say I disagree, Gabby," he said finally. "On the other hand, if the stories about what happened to 11th Fleet and Admiral Crandall are anything to go by, this could get interesting." "One way to put it, sir," Timberlake agreed. "On the other hand, I think I like the thinking behind this. The bastards can't have those killer missile pods and their damn super dreadnoughts everywhere." "They don't need to have them everywhere to ruin our whole day," Capriotti pointed out. "They only have to have them wherever we turn up." "I know, sir." The Admiral's flag captain shrugged. "Sooner or later, though, we've got to take it to them. And given what they did to Admiral Filoretta, it looks like fleet engagements are going to be a really bad idea until our tech people can figure out how to match their damned missiles." Capriotti nodded soberly. The Solarian League did need to take it to the Manties after the series of massive black eyes the Star Empire and its allies had handed the SLN. Despite any misgivings he might feel, he agreed with the captain about that. He just wished to hell he was more confident those in charge of the taking in question had at least a vague notion of what they were doing. He wasn't prepared to wholeheartedly accept the Solarian news report's version of what had happened to Massimo Filoretta. According to the Manties, 11th Fleet had opened fire after being summoned to surrender. According to the usually reliable sources, talking to the newsies speaking off the record because they weren't authorized to disclose classified information, Filoretta had accepted their surrender terms, then been blown out of space in an act of cold-blooded mass murder. And according to any official O&I analyses, no one in old Chicago could find his arse with both hands and approach radar well enough to give one Vincent Capriotti a single damned clue which of those diametrically opposed analyses the Navy shared. Not a good sign, he thought again. Of course, intelligence has been caught with its trousers around its ankles every step of the way this far. Maybe the real bad sign would be for the idiots to actually think they did know what happened. Vincent Capriotti was battle fleet from the ground up, and he'd known dozens, scores of men and women in the ships Crandall and Filoretta had lost. Like Timberlake, he wanted payback, and not just out of bloody-minded vengeance, although he was honest enough to admit that was a great deal of his motivation. In addition to that, however, he had a rather better idea than many of his battle fleet compatriots of just how critical the Office of Frontier Security's unofficial empire of client star systems truly was. And along with that, he recognized that OFS's arrangements were far more fragile than they might appear. The Solarian League literally couldn't afford what would happen to the federal government's cash flow if Frontier Security started shedding clients, and unless they demonstrated that they could stand up to the Manties, that was precisely what was going to happen. On the other hand, the one thing of which Capriotti was certain was that if the battle, or massacre, or whatever, of Manticore had been as short as both sets of reports suggested, he did not want to tangle with the sort of defenses Manties seemed to think were appropriate for major star systems. Fortunately, judging from the synopsis of Operation Buccaneer, that wasn't what Admiral Kingsford had in mind. So maybe someone in old Chicago did have a clue what he was doing. Maybe. "All right," he said finally, turning away from the dispatch to gaze at SLNS Quebec's main astrogation plot. "I need to get Admiral Helland and Admiral Rutgers up to speed on this. I'm sure they'll both have useful input. Once Rutgers stops warning us not to be overly optimistic, of course." His lips twitched, and Timberlake actually chuckled. Rear Admiral Liang Tao Rutgers, Task Force 783's operations officer, had started out in Frontier Fleet and transferred to Battle Fleet barely 20 years ago. That hadn't been long enough to completely free him of the basic Frontier Fleet attitude that Battle Fleet would have made an excellent paperweight, especially if that got it out of the way of the people doing the Navy's real work. Along the way, he'd been known to offer pithy analyses of just how out-of-date Battle Fleet's strategic and tactical thinking might have become, and he'd argued strenuously that training simulations and fleet problems should be restructured to match the Navy against true peer competitors, despite the fact that everyone knew there were none in real life. When confronted with that fact, he'd suggested that it might be better to train against an opponent better than anyone might actually have to fight. At least that error was unlikely to get anyone killed. Not, as his attitude had made evident, that he'd expected anyone in Battle Fleet to give much thought to that possibility. The flag captain was pretty sure that attitude explained why an officer of Rutgers' obvious competence, and with the Rutgers family's military and political connections, was still only a rear admiral. But it was rather refreshing in a lot of ways. Recent events had sure as hell validated his warnings, and she knew Capriotti both respected and genuinely appreciated his contrarian viewpoint. Vice Admiral Angelica Helland, TF-783's chief of staff, on the other hand, reminded a lot of people of a smarter Sandra Crandall. Of course, she could hardly have been a stupider Sandra Crandall, now that Timberlake thought about it. The contrast between her aggressive near-arrogance and Rutgers' voice of caution made for occasionally fractious staff meetings, but it also offered Capriotti a robust debate between differing viewpoints. That was something he'd valued even before anyone started shooting at the SLN, which had been rare, to say the least, among Battlefleet 4-star admirals. At the moment, Helland and Rutgers were in transit back to Quebec from observing a training simulation aboard the battlecruiser Bavaria, the flagship of TG 783.12. Thanks to the classification level of the dispatch, they had no idea why they'd been summoned home so abruptly. Be interesting to watch their reactions, the flag captain thought. Just between you and me, I'm all in favor of our not being overly optimistic, sir, she said aloud, and Capriotti nodded. You and me both, he agreed. Please have me informed as soon as they come back aboard. In the meantime, I'm going to the flag briefing room. I want to go through this ammunition manifest, and I especially want to review ONI's most recent estimate of Manti missile capabilities. He shook his head, his expression turning grimmer, and Timberlake raised an eyebrow at him. I've only skimmed it so far, he said, but I'm inclined to think it's still over-optimistic, let's say. The flag captain's raised eyebrows segued into a slight frown. She, too, had skimmed the new estimate. There'd been no time to go through the analysis itself, but the conclusion section had been depressing. Intelligence's current metric gave the Mantis and their allies a 3-to-1 advantage in throw weight, a 30% advantage in penetration aids, and a maximum powered envelope of 30 million kilometers. That was more than enough to be going on with, in her opinion. I'm not saying Mantis are 10 meters tall, Gabby, Capriotti said wryly. And the new cataphracts can match any range they've got if we incorporate a ballistic phase. But you and I both know Liang Tao is right on the money when he says we totally underestimated what the Mantis could do to us. Shouldn't have taken a genius, or so damned long for ONI to realize that either, which says some pretty unfortunate things about our pre-war analysts. Since the shooting started, though, the Mantis have made Liang Tao's point for him, painfully enough, not even our brilliant masters can miss it. I'm delighted they've sent us these new missiles, and I understand that Technodynes tweaked their performance again. But until I've got something just a little more solid than our best guess about enemy capabilities from the same idiots who brought us Sandra Crandall and 11th Fleet, I'm not going to make any rash assumptions about miraculously level playing fields. Works for me, sir. Timberlake shook her head. Better we overestimate them than underestimate them. Fortunately, it sounds like someone back in old Chicago's figured that out too. Capriotti twitched his head at the dispatch they'd just finished viewing. I can't say I'm delighted at the notion of blowing up anyone's star systems. That's not what I joined the Navy to do, and I have friends living in Cachalot for that matter. But whoever came up with this idea Whether it was Admiral Bernard or Admiral Kingsford himself, I think it's the best one available to us at the moment. If we can cause enough pain to their peripheral star systems, or the independent star nations trading with them, they'll have to disperse at least some of their forces to commerce and infrastructure protection. And the more we can keep them dispersed, the more likely we are to encourage a certain circumspection on their part, until Technodyne finally figures out how to build a genuine multi-drive missile of our own. Timberlake nodded, although both of them understood the additional point Capriotti had chosen not to make. Operation Buccaneer wasn't just about forcing the Manties and their allies to spread themselves thinner. In fact, that wasn't even what it was primarily about. Its real purpose was to warn anyone who might even think about signing up with the Manties, whether as ally or simple trading partner, that the decision would be unwise, that the SLN would consider that anyone who sided with Manticore had just sided against the Solarian League, and that the consequences would be dire enough to discourage anyone else from following her example. In fact, it was a terror campaign, directed against those unable to defend themselves. And if anyone might have missed that little point, TF-783's assigned target would make it abundantly clear. The Cachalot system, 50.6 LY from Tsung and only 49.6 LY from Beowulf, was an independent system which had opted against joining the Solarian League when it was initially founded. It was also a prosperous, heavily populated system which had been a Beowulf trading partner for the better part of 1,000 years and depended on the Beowulf System Defense Force to provide its rapid response security force. Its organic military forces consisted of no more than a couple of dozen frigates and lacks, because no one would be insane enough to attack someone so closely associated with one of the League's founding and most powerful star systems. Until now, at least. She wondered just how explicitly Kingsford or Brenner, the CO of Strategy and Planning, had admitted Buccaneer's true objectives in the detailed operational orders. And while she was wondering, she wondered how many of those independent and nominally independent star systems would recognize that the League was choosing to target them because it dared not attack the members of the Grand Alliance directly. Bit of a potential downside there, Gabby, my girl, she reflected, then shrugged mentally. Maybe that's another reason to pick Cachalot. It's close enough to Beowulf that systems farther out in the fringe may not realize how lightly defended it is. Even if they do, we've got to do something, though. And thank God no one is planning on sending us after one of the Manties' primary star systems, given how quick they smashed up Philoretta. Her thought trailed off, and she nodded again, more firmly. I just hope Technodyne, or somebody, gets its thumb out and moves right along with that multi-drive missile of yours, sir.
That was another entry in the complete serialization of Uncompromising Honor by David Weber. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks to Audible.com. Special thanks to David Afsharirad. Thanks, Pard. And to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. And the coprolitic anti-chips for a hearty round of dinosaur poker, angelic petticoat-kicking ingenues, and thanks, praise, and gratitude for David Boop, Mercedes Lackey, Joe R. Lansdale, and Jonathan Maberry, editor and authors of Straight Outta Dodge City. Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy. And keep reaching for the stars, partner.